Good morning, everyone. Hope you're having a great Thursday so far. I want to thank you very much for joining us for this office hour sessions for ADA and design, construction, and maintenance. So this is a follow-up session to the webinar that took place back in August, which many of you may have attended. So during this session, we've got Brad Bradley from FDOT and Carrie Shepard from FHWA that are here with us today. So we are going to, this is going to be a very laid back session. We're not doing certificates for this training. This is an opportunity for you to ask questions to Brad and Carrie today. I've got some questions that were submitted during registration. We've also got some questions that were left over from the session in August, but you can also ask your questions live, type them into the chat, or raise your hand and speak out loud. So again, we're the Florida LTAP Center. We offer a variety of services to our local agencies, as you can see here on your screen. We have a lot of recorded training, so in case you missed the live session of this from August, it is available on our recorded webinar page, so just visit that and you can search for ADA to bring that up. And you can find us on social media with the handle FLLTAP. All right, and without further ado, I am going to hand things over to Brad to we are going to share a PowerPoint some of the questions that we received. But like I said, it's not a formal session. And Carrie, if you both want to introduce yourselves and kind of tell everyone who you are, then we'll go ahead and get started.
Well, good morning, and thank you, Kristen. And of course, thanks as always for organizing this. I'm Carrie Shepard. I'm the Civil Rights Officer for Federal Highway Administration. I cover Florida, Puerto Rico, and the Virgin Islands. The ADA is only one of 8 programs that I work, but I work very closely in conjunction with my state partner, Brad Bradley, and I'll turn it to Brad.
Well, hi, everybody. Thank you, Carrie, and good morning. As Carrie stated, my name is Brad Bradley. I am the state ADA coordinator for the DOT, and I work out of the Office of Design in the central office in Tallahassee. And within the Office of Design, I'm in the production support project management section. So, of course, as the statewide ADA coordinator, it's my job to coordinate the activities of the department to make sure that we're providing safe and accessible pedestrian facilities along the state highway system. So I think what we'll do is we'll go ahead and get right into the questions. Kristen, can you see my screen okay?
Yes, we sure can.
All right, thank you. All right, so first we're going to hit some of the questions that were submitted during registration. And the first question that you see on the screen says, can you discuss pedestrian push buttons orientation? In other words, 2 buttons attached to a single pole, meeting ADA standards. A schematic would be helpful. Well, as it turns out, we do have a drawing in the standard plans. So on your screen now, you should be seeing standard plans index 665001. And up here in the upper left corner, and I'm going to try to zoom in as best I can here, you see the button placement here is dimensioned with a 3 foot 6 inch plus or minus 6 inch allowable. So the standard placement is 3 foot 6 inches above the walking surface, and then there's a plus or minus 6 inch, call it a tolerance, whatever you want to call it. It's a wiggle room. So with that, if you have buttons placed on the same pole, then that plus or minus 6 inch allowable tolerance there will enable you to be able to shift the buttons vertically relative to each other and still stay within that compliant range. And that's what I've been told by the standard plans folks has been determined to be the best solution for buttons on the same pole, is that by shifting them vertically relative to each other, then there shouldn't be any conflicts with the wiring inside the pole or with the actual button equipment itself. So hopefully that answers the question there.
So Brad, we did have a question come in kind of related to that. So
Sure.
I just wanted to kind of throw it in here. So wanting to know, can you discuss the maximum distance from the push button to the crosswalk on a corner and at a mid-block crossing?
That's actually a good question, and it's the answer to that question is one that I'm not completely familiar with. My first response, though, would be to refer to the FDOT's TEM, the Traffic Engineering Manual. Then I would suggest looking at standard plans because it provides some limited guidance in that regard. But I think probably the governing document for answering that question is probably going to be found in the MUTCD. There is specific dimensional guidance and requirements in the MUTCD for where the button needs to be placed relative to the ramp. And not being familiar with that, I don't want to speculate on what that value should be.
All right, thanks, Brad.
Certainly, thanks, Kristen. Moving to the next question. The next question says, what materials are allowed? What materials are allowed to provide for a non-slip temporary ADA compliant sidewalk? To my knowledge of the ADA regulations and standards, there's really no requirement for what type of material the walking surface should be comprised of. Typically for the DOT, we use concrete for sidewalks, and I think asphalt is probably the most commonly used material for shared use paths. But in a temporary condition, we've seen asphalt millings used, and that's fine. That's perfectly fine as long as it's installed in such a way and maintained accordingly that it remains firm, stable, and slip resistant for the entire duration of its being open to the public. We've also seen plywood walkways, plywood ramps used. Again, I don't think there's any limitation on the material. There's only a requirement on the functional use of the walking surface, that it remain firm, stable, and slip resistant.
And Brad, it's almost always, it's rare that we see a material chosen that's wrong. I think mostly it's all the materials you choose, even if you choose those terrific Moby mats, they require maintenance. Got to check them, make sure everything is buckling, making sure if you're using wrap that that's not too loose and is no longer firm. But the actual product, I think the sky's the limit as long as you can maintain it in a firm, stable, and slip resistant manner.
I agree, Kerry. The key word there is maintain it. Pretty much anything goes, like you said, the sky's the limit, but it must be kept in a firm, stable, and slip resistant fashion. Thank you, Kerry. Next question is, traffic control plans often include temporary curb ramps. Has the department any items for the APL or specifications to standardize? And unfortunately for this one, I think the answer is no. We don't currently have any attempt, I guess, to standardize their use, which I said that was unfortunate, but maybe it's an opportunity for the design community to have the ability to utilize some innovative products and provide some innovative solutions here. So at the end of the day, the temporary facility must be compliant with the accessibility criteria for widths and slopes and ramps and so forth. So not having a standardized product available on the APL at this point, to use Kerry's phrase again, just makes the sky the limit as far as what can be utilized. But at the end of the day, it must remain compliant with the ADA criteria. Kerry, do you have anything to add there?
Brad, I wanted to go back just real quick. I pulled up the MUTCD reference on the location or the distance of the ped buttons from the curb ramp. It's 4E.08 is the MUTCD reference, and it's between 1.5 and 6 feet from the edge of curb, shoulder, or pavement, with, of course, the push button being parallel to the path of travel. I hope that answers that question.
Carrie, I think it does, but I think you brought up another key point there that I should have highlighted with that question, is that the button faceplate and the sign that's associated with the button, it is imperative and required at the national level from the MUTCD that the button face and sign plate be positioned parallel to the direction of travel. Unfortunately, this is a problem that we've seen statewide, not just on the state highway system, but also on the local, the city and county roadways. We see it probably more often than not installed exactly 90 degrees incorrectly, with the button face and the sign plate essentially pointing down the direction of the crossing, positioned perpendicular to the direction of the crossing rather than parallel. And the reason why the MUTCD requires a parallel placement is because that becomes a detectable element that a person with a visual disability can reach out and touch. And when they touch that sign plate or the button face, then they have been given clear communication that's effectively telling them the direction of the appropriate direction of the crossing. So the reason why that information is found in the MUTCD is so that there is national consistency with every state in the union, so that a person who travels from state to state and is utilizing the pedestrian facilities along the roadway, they can navigate and correctly utilize the pedestrian signal installations. But if we don't have consistency, even I've seen intersections within Florida that there's inconsistency even within the same intersection on the 4 different corners.
That's so true. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think what we need to be doing as designers, what our contractors need to be doing when they're installing these, and then our CEIs need to be inspecting and making sure that the final result is as intended. We need to be making sure, we must be making sure that the PED button and sign plate are positioned so that they are parallel to the direction of the crossing that they serve. I can't
We're flunking
emphasize that
this
enough.
today. And it's
Say
not
that again,
just
Carrie.
the state, it's every local that we visited. We found at least one example of where the PED signals and PED buttons are misaligned. And I don't know, I'm sure everyone travels into other states, and we're an excellent state for accessibility. I've seen just dreadful things out there, but this is one area where we struggle, and that we're going to have to do better. I think it goes to the safety of the crossing for one, and then the second thing is just so that people who visit Florida are have the same expectation as if when they visit Georgia or Alabama or somewhere else. So
Sure.
it's a real critical issue, and one that Brad and I are tackling every year now.
That's right. And one of the recent updates to the standard plans, Carrie, actually took that guidance information about the orientation of the button out of just a text note and actually put it into a diagram so that it's pictorially provided to the users of the standard plans, indicating and showing that the orientation, the correct orientation of the button is parallel to the direction of crossing that it's serving. Unfortunately, and I've asked the standard plans folks about this, it doesn't seem to be any more adjustments that we can make to the standard plans to make it more clear. I mean, a picture speaks 1,000 words, right? So we're highlighting it as we travel and talk to folks, especially in opportunities like the one we're doing now. We want to emphasize the appropriate orientation of the button is parallel to the direction of crossing. So hopefully we'll get that message out there. But it is a requirement of the ADA that we have and provide effective communication with all individuals, including those who have a disability of some sort or another. And the way we can effectively communicate the safe and accessible use of the pedestrian facility is by being consistent with our button configuration. And we must be consistent with the national standard. So hopefully I didn't beat that dead horse too much.
Well, before you move on, there was another question. Are there any ADA requirements for the maximum distance to the push button from the crosswalk?
Carrie, do you still have the MUTCD open?
I do. It looks like 6 feet is the is what MUTCD section 4E.08 is listing between 1.5 and 6 feet from the edge of the curb, shoulder, or the pavement.
When I've gone around the state and I've visited all 8 districts in Florida this year to give in-person live training, as I do that, I communicate the idea. I guess it's kind of a new idea for designers to think about a pedestrian as a design vehicle, and then think of that pedestrian who has a visual disability. Think of the pedestrian that has an auditory disability, um, and think about how that design vehicle would safely navigate the pedestrian facility that's being provided, because we cannot discriminate against someone who has a disability. That's the whole purpose of the ADA. So we must think proactively as we're providing these designs. What is the proper orientation of the button that's going to communicate safely and accessibly the direction of the crossing? What can we do with the design elements such as the curb ramp? How can we align the curb ramp so that it's going to assist in effectively and properly communicating the direction of the crossing? Where there's a flush transition, we call that a blended transition between the sidewalk and the roadway. So there's no curb ramp and there's no curb ramp elements. Well, can we orient the edge lines of the sidewalk so that it's providing and effectively communicating that directional information so that a person can through tactile input determine what the crossing direction is? This is just something that if our design community will become more proactive in considering, then I think we can take the accessibility of the state highway system pedestrian facility to the next level. And Carrie already mentioned that we do a really good job in Florida, but there's still some opportunities where we can do a little bit better. Okay, I guess hearing no more follow-ups on that topic, we'll go to the next question. Has anyone implemented audible notifications in pedestrian maintenance of traffic, or what we call now TTC, temporary traffic control? How do you address advanced sidewalk closure for blind pedestrians? Well, this is a really good question. And actually, we just received this specific question from one of our local agencies in District 6. And currently, the DOT APL does not have any of the audible notification equipment available, which again, while it while it while it presents a challenge, it also presents an opportunity for the design community to work with the district project manager in construction to see if one of the vendor products that you're able to locate might be appropriate for use. But again, the Title II of the ADA requires effective communication with all our users, including those who have a disability. So if we're going to have a sidewalk closure along a urban area block, but the actual closure occurs at the far end from which a person is traveling, then advance notice of that closure would definitely be an opportunity to take advantage of some of these audible notification products that are available. I do know that our construction office is currently looking into this, but as of yet, we haven't settled on a particular product or grouping of products to include on the APL. Hopefully that answers the question. If not, I did a lot of talking. that was not necessary. But those are the only questions that we received, right, Kristen, for the registration of this office hours time?
Yeah, so those were the questions that we received in advance from folks that registered for today. And because we have so much time, we wanted to go ahead and put in questions from that we received in August. But the questions from you that are here today, right now, that are coming into the chat are definitely going to take priority. And Brad, we do
Sure.
have a couple of these. So,
Okay.
yeah, so the first one is saying, could you please discuss ADA compliant crossings at railroads?
Hmm. That's a good question. The FDM Chapter 222, I can't remember the subsection of that addresses railroad crossings, but there's some guidance there on the appropriate placement of detectable warning systems, or MATs, the DWS, detectable warning surface. There's guidance there as to where it should be placed when there is not a pedestrian gate being used to protect pedestrians, and when there is a pedestrian gate. It's basically the distance from the gate or the railing, whichever condition you have. Also, the MUTCD provides guidance, and it may be addressed also in the DOT's traffic engineering manual, the TEM, for the introduction of audible signals. Very similar to an APS, an accessible pedestrian signal, but it's specific for a railroad crossing. And just as kind of a heads up to things that are coming in the future, is that, and you may have seen it in the news recently, that Brightline is looking at speeding up their trains, possibly to a range of 80 miles an hour to 110 miles per hour. So they'll be increasing from currently 79 or less to the range. It's called higher speed trains. The speed range would be between 80 and 110. So with the trains getting faster, um, the crossing clearance time, if you will, for both vehicles and pedestrians, as you would imagine, would be a lot. It would need to have a lot more careful attention paid to it. So look for additional guidance coming out from the FDOT um, as that discussion progresses. But right now there is the pedestrian crossing of a railroad is addressed in Chapter 222. So if after you look at that section, if you still have questions, then please feel free to reach out to me either by phone or by email.
Hey, Brad, can you talk a little bit though about the actual condition of the crossing once it's on railroad property, once it's on their right of way? Of course, we see issues with that where there's changes in level, a wider
Mhm.
gap at the flange where the rail is. What's acceptable? What are we seeing used? And how do you work with a railroad that maybe doesn't return your call?
But if you're having trouble working with the railroad and they're not returning your phone calls, then I would suggest give me a call, and I'm going to reach out to Kerry because he's already indicated that he's got some um, connections at the Federal Rail Association that could possibly help us out. Is that a good answer for that part, Kerry?
It is. Y'all, please give us a call. Don't make your part compliant and then leave the rest of the crossing as non-compliant and then tell us that, well, it's not our right of way. We can't do anything. We totally get it. We know what the expense is, and we know it's not always easy to work with our rail partners, but please give us a holler and let us know if you're really having that problem. If I feel strongly that we're never going to achieve vision zero if we don't go a little bit beyond what our minimum responsibilities are. And I think in this case, working with the railroads is going to be very important. But Brad and I are willing to help you. There's a terrific rail safety office at FDOT that has good relationships with all the rail entities. And then, as he mentioned, I've got contacts at the Federal Rail Administration. And if things get really bad, we'll go to them and say, hey, we need help.
Yeah. And again, this is a good opportunity to emphasize again the marriage, if you will, between safety and accessibility, because this is obviously a potentially dangerous situation for both vehicles and pedestrians, especially as we have trains that are looking at using higher speeds up to 110 miles per hour. That's very fast. I was in Miami a month or two ago, and I got stopped at one of these rail crossings, and the train was coming, and I was expecting it to be traveling like I'm accustomed to seeing, relatively slowly. And it came through. It was like four or five cars. It was a bright line, and it was through the intersection before I could blink twice. I mean, it was moving very quickly. So you can
And they're
imagine
so
why.
quiet. The equipment
Yes.
is much quieter than what we're used to growing up in the South and hearing the train. This is fast, quiet equipment. It's dangerous.
So I'm showing a slide from the presentation, the training that we did back in August on the screen currently. Um, just to emphasize that this information is from the FDM Chapter 222, and we want to make sure that any pedestrian facility that we have approaching an intersection with a railroad, that pedestrian facility needs to be carried continuously through the railroad crossing, just like the roadway would be. Um, I think I emphasized the point in the training here with the red crossing markings that I'm showing at the bottom right of this slide picture, to make sure that all of the components of the pedestrian facility are actually working together to emphasize the safety and accessibility. You can see here, this might be an opportunity. This is definitely an opportunity for improvement, because you have the traffic gate um, that when it comes down, the crossing markings and the ramp that frame into the sidewalk at that location are actually on the wrong side of the gate, as far as being protected from the potential railroad traffic there. So in my view, the crossing should have been moved back to the far side of the gate, rather than on the near side to the rail. Additionally, as Carrie had inquired, we want to make sure that the crossing completely remains firm, stable, slip resistant, and that there are no instantaneous changes in level. That's vertical elevation changes of the walking surface are limited still to 1/4 inch max. Anything above 1/4 of an inch is non-compliant with the ADA and would be subject to some sort of penalty and correction. Also want to make sure that and this almost goes without saying if we're talking about changes in level being limited to 1/4 of an inch, but the walking surface leading to the rail and in between the rails must align with the top of the rails. Otherwise, you're going to impose a change in level. Here on the screen is a figure that's showing the proper detectable warning surface location relative to a crossing that has a pedestrian gate. It should be 4 foot minimum from the far side of the gate relative to the rail crossing. And then on the right side is a picture of a pedestrian crossing a rail where there is no pedestrian gate. And in that case, the detectable warning surface is supposed to be placed within 6 to 15 feet from the closest rail. There's also information there. Let's see, I'm just scanning through there. Okay, I'm getting ahead of myself. On the next slide, it talks about the addition of MUTCD specified audible signals. I would also urge you to check out the DOT's TEM. I don't know if there's anything there regarding audible signals for railroads, but if the DOT wants to expand upon what the MUTCD requires, then that's probably where you would find that information. And this slide shows a railroad crossing of the roadway, and there's a couple of vehicles traversing across the railroad. And emphasized by this photo is the flangeway gap that is necessary on the inside of each of the rails. And that flangeway gap is necessary for the train to be able to operate through that crossing. And there's a little screenshot of a train axle with the two wheels, and it shows that the wheel has a flange on the inside of the rail, and that flange, of course, as you can imagine, is there for horizontal placekeeping. So that flange requires that a horizontal opening be placed in the crossing. And that flangeway gap, as it's called, is limited to 2.5 inches horizontal opening for non-freight rail and 3-inch for a freight rail track. So ideally, you'd want your pedestrian facility to cross the track at a 90-degree angle, be perfectly perpendicular to the railroad tracks, and that's going to benefit not only pedestrians with a disability who are using wheelchairs, but it's also going to help your bikers and so forth, to make sure that those narrow tired um, mobility devices or bicycles don't get jammed within that flangeway gap. Okay, and so I think that covers everything. Carrie, can you think of anything else for the railroad crossing?
Just that, we've been seeing more of those rubberized flangeways, and more of the concrete rather than that old beat up asphalt between the rails. So things are getting better than they've been. But I think sometimes it does take working with the rail company, rather than, and I know this is an old example, the city of Tallahassee routed a sidewalk into a roadway because they simply couldn't get CSX to assist. And we had to
Right.
go back and kind of say, this is illegal. You're going to get someone killed, and let's work with the rail company. So sometimes it takes reaching out to your partners to make that ideal solution
Sure,
happen.
sure. All right, thank you, Carrie.
So I have a question on slide 62 here. Someone's asking,
Okay,
what is the difference between aligned and flush?
I I think it's just different words meaning pretty much the same thing. Um, the idea there is that the walking surface remains it remains smooth, and there are no vertical changes in levels. So the yeah, I think it's just the use of two different words, pretty much meaning the same thing.
All right, thanks. And I didn't mention this earlier to everyone, but we do have the slides from August that are in the handout section. So if you recall something that you had a question on, and you can refer to the slide number and you want to pop that question into the chat, we'll be glad to cover that. And then speaking of which, we actually had someone that had a question about slide 41 here, Brad, from the original presentation. So
Okay.
they said on that slide, it's showing a skew angle of the crosswalk striping versus truncated dome pad, and just wanting to know if that should be realigned.
Okay, that is actually a common question, asking about the alignment of the truncated dome pattern with the direction of the crossing. And I think it stems from a misunderstanding that goes all the way back to when the truncated dome pattern first was released. But just to clear up any misunderstanding, the dome pattern is not required to align perfectly with the direction of the crossing, although that is a best practice. Don't get me wrong. If it's possible to align the truncated dome pattern perfectly with the direction of the crossing, then do it. Definitely, that is a best practice. DOT only requires it to be perfectly aligned when the dome when the detectable warning surface is on a longitudinal slope of 5% or greater. So essentially a ramp, a curb ramp. So in this case, I don't know what the longitudinal slope of that ramp is. This is Cascades Park in Tallahassee, right in front of the DOT central office building. Um, so if that ramp is 5% or greater, then the dome alignment would be required.
All right. In a related question, not necessarily to this picture, but should the grade break on a sidewalk occur before or after the truncated dome surface? And if it's after, um, the warning surface can have a slope of 12 to 1. Is that correct?
I'm not sure I exactly understand, but if I in my thinking or my hearing of that question, the detectable warning surface cannot be placed over a grade break. It's got to be on a constant slope surface. And we want the grade breaks relative to the direction of pedestrian travel to be perpendicular, because otherwise, if you have diagonally located joints in the walking surface between different grades, then you're going to create a compound slope condition. And if you can imagine a fixed chassis wheelchair, manual, especially a manual wheelchair, you might end up with a situation where you have uplift of one of the three wheels, which is definitely an instability situation and could be dangerous for the user. Um, but I'm not sure if I fully understood the question, Kristen.
Yeah, so the person that entered that, if you have additional clarification, if you want to just type that in, we'll be glad to revisit that for sure.
Or they could unmute and speak, right?
Absolutely, yeah, that is an option. I know no one generally likes to take advantage of that. I guess people are shy, but if you want to be unmuted and speak, just raise your hand in the control panel or tell me in the chat, and we can definitely do that. And you can talk directly to Brad and Carrie and get your question answered.
Hey, Brad, this is a little off the topic, but can you talk a little about aligning ramps with the crossing and,
Definitely.
what's lawful versus what should we really be striving for?
Okay, let me see if I can find my slide from the August training that addresses this best, so I can speak to it. Here we go. But you can see here, Carrie, that excuse me, the ramp on the far end has physical elements that are non-visual, but they are physically detectable, and they're in line with the crossing that in my view would clearly and effectively communicate the direction of the crossing. On the near side of this crossing, unfortunately, it looks like the designer didn't have foresight to consider a different orientation of the curb lines could be pretty easily provided, in my view, that would also provide that non-visual, physically detectable element that would clearly and effectively communicate the direction of the crossing. So just by shifting these existing curb lines to as I've shown them here with bold red lines, um, a very simple shift, if you will, during design would make this crossing much more accessible than than the as-built situation that we have here. So the idea is that, again, the ADA Title II regulations require state and local governments to have effective communication with persons with disabilities, and it must be as effective as it is with all of our users or all of our customers. In my view, the as-built condition here is not providing effective communication so that the crossing can be as safe and accessible as possible. But the way I've drawn it in here, I think would be a very simple um, fix for that condition.
Thanks, Brad. And, if the question is Federal Highway and FDOT going to fly down on you and tell you how it's non-compliant and how we're not going to reimburse? Well, no, probably not. But if you look at the actual crossing surface, people who have low vision are dependent on the condition of that thermoplastic, the way it looks, and blind people are going to be dependent on the condition of the thermoplastic for how it feels under a white cane. So conceivably, you could be putting someone on a path of travel that they shouldn't be on. And of course, it's all circumstantial and locational, so it depends on where you are. But I think Brad's right. A little forethought might have made this a better crossing.
Right, and Carrie, you brought up a good point, and it's a question that I get often as I provide the training, and people ask, well, isn't thermoplastic supposed to be detectable under cane? And the answer to that is likely yes, but it's going to be more detectable the day it's put down than it will be a year from when it's installed, and then it will be 5 years. So the further you get from that installation date, the thermoplastic, that thin um, the thickness of the thermoplastic is going to wear down, definitely in the wheel path, but overall, it's going to become less detectable. So I don't think that it's the best choice to rely on the detectability of the thermoplastic of the crossing markings, especially since we also in Florida have unmarked crossings. So the better non-visual physical elements that we can provide on both ends of the crossing, I think will do a better service for all users. And again, speaking to the idea of safety and accessibility, anything that we do to increase the accessibility for persons with disabilities of our pedestrian features is definitely going to increase the overall safety for all users.
Thanks, Brad. Good stuff.
Certainly.
So we had some clarification come in on that question earlier. So about the detectable surfaces. So can the detectable surface be in the 12:1 transition slope before the landing at the street?
That would put it on a 8.3% slope. So it would have to align perfectly with the direction of the crossing, for one. And two, I would say that it might be better if the landing at the bottom of the ramp was able to be oriented so that it was long enough, if you will, for a 2-foot depth detectable warning surface. I think the better placement would be on the level landing. But there may be some configurations and site specific conditions that necessitate it otherwise. And in those cases, like Carrie said, we're not gonna um, jump on you for an improper installation. We're actually relying pretty heavily on engineering judgment of our engineers of record to provide the best solution that they can provide given the constraints of the location. So a lot of times, excuse me, you may find that if you have a room full of 100 engineers and you present them with a location to design a ped facility for, you're probably going to end up with close to 100 different solutions. So there's not one answer or one size that fits all, but we just want the engineer to give appropriate consideration for that, again, that pedestrian design vehicle, for a pedestrian that doesn't have the advantage of sight, or for a pedestrian who has a hearing disability. What are the features that we can enhance in that environment to make it safer and accessible for them?
And I'll take that a little farther, Brad, because I'm a lawyer, not an engineer, and I have no business questioning your engineering judgment, and I won't, as long as it's clear and documented. And it's when we're not sure why a decision was made, or you simply refer to a standard drawing, that it becomes a lot harder for us to defend if we have to. So if you made a decision and you think it's the best one, document that so that we can see it, and and take your part.
That's a that, that's actually a good point, Carrie, that you bring up, is that when the best design that could be provided by the engineer of record may not be fully compliant with DOT's requirement, that's fine. It just, as Carrie just stated, it requires the processing of a design variation that's going to be approved by the district design engineer. I have learned over time and with interaction with our design consultants that the processing of a design variation has a negative connotation with some of them. And I would suggest to you that you need to try to think about it a little differently, that it's not necessarily a negative to have to process a design variation, because design variations sometimes are absolutely necessary because the site constraints and the configuration, um, the plan area configuration that you have necessitates doing something a little bit, uh, let's say, a little bit different than what the criteria requires. And that will be okay if it's the best we can do and it's documented. If there's ever a question from the public or from any litigation about that location, then as long as it's documented, in other words, we're following our own rules, and our rules state that we're going to be fully compliant with the DOT, FDM, standard plans, and specifications. But where we're not able to be compliant with those requirements, we're going to document the engineering judgment that goes into providing the condition that we have as in the as-built. So if we're following our own rules, we're going to be, we're setting ourselves up for the best success in that situation.
Great, thanks, Brad. I've got a question that I think would be kind of applicable to this photo you have on screen here. So if you have a condition where the angle of the road and the sidewalk is not perpendicular and an aligned curb ramp is not practical, isn't the detectable warning mat orientation used to provide the orientation needed for the visually impaired individuals?
Well, that's getting back to that common misunderstanding that I spoke about earlier. While it is definitely considered best practice to align the grid pattern of the detectable warning surface, it's not a requirement unless it's on a slope of 5% or greater. So in the condition that you described, where you have a non-perpendicular configuration of the crossing, maybe that's an opportunity to provide some innovative solutions. But I would definitely strongly urge consideration for providing to the best or to the greatest extent possible those non-visual physically detectable elements that will clearly and effectively communicate the direction of the crossing. Now, if you think about it, if typically a perpendicular pedestrian crossing between the parallel curbs of both directions of travel is going to be the shortest distance for a pedestrian to cross vehicular traffic. So the more skewed that crossing becomes relative to the those parallel curb lines, the longer the crossing is, and potentially the greater risk of exposure to traffic a pedestrian is going to have. So sometimes the best solution is going to be pulling back those stop bars, and rather than providing a diagonal crossing, you pull the stop bars back and you provide one that's going to be you provide a crossing that's going to be the shortest distance possible. Now that's going to impact other disciplines within the roadway design arena, like the distance to the signal head from the stop bar. There's a set maximum there, and if you exceed that maximum, then you have to provide an auxiliary arm or an auxiliary signal for that condition. That's going to be added cost. But a good engineer is going to take all of these design considerations into effect and try to provide the best solution under their engineering judgment that they can.
I would only add to that that, if you do take the trouble to align the domes with the path of travel, you're probably the only one who's going to notice. In my professional experience in working with Lighthouse for the Blind and other disability service groups, the people who are taught to wayfind, they go through classes in order to wayfind with white cane. The detectable warning does not indicate to them a path of travel, so they're not going to be risking their lives on whether that dome alignment is with the path of travel, merely that they're at a point where they're entering a vehicular environment.
Yeah, that's a good point, Kerry. And if you've ever had any of the ADA training that was offered by my predecessor, Dean Perkins, from years past, you may have heard him say that the dome alignment with the path of travel, the direction of the crossing, is going to be important for people who are, they might be in a wheelchair and they might have a head, neck, or back injury type of thing. So by aligning the dome pattern with the direction of travel is going to provide an opportunity for the wheels of the wheelchair to potentially miss the truncated domes themselves. Remember that the detectable warning surface is there for the visually impaired. It's not there for the mobility impaired. So I can explain more fully why the development occurred and why we have what we have today. But suffice it to say that if the domes can align with the direction of travel, that would be nice, especially for people who are in wheelchairs, because they could conceivably go over the detectable warning surface without actually feeling the influence of those domes on the wheels. But like Carrie said, the visually impaired are not necessarily relying on it for direction as much as they're relying on it as a definitive indicator that they're leaving the relative protection of the ped facility and they're entering into a vehicular way. So it functions as a stop sign for them.
And can I just say how proud I am of Florida? It's been years since we've had anyone ask whether or not the detectable warnings are there to stop wheelchairs from rolling into the road. Last month, I was in New Mexico, and a civil rights lawyer asked me that, whether,
Oh no.
how the truncated domes serve as a braking mechanism for, I suppose, out of control mobility devices. And I was ashamed for him, and I was ashamed for New Mexico, and I was happy to come back to Florida.
Mm. My goodness. Well, thank you, Carrie. Kristen,
All
what's
right.
next?
Yeah. All right. So we had a question asked a little bit ago. So this person's asking, so many contractors they say give them pushback when they're requiring them to provide a proper pedestrian access route on the project that meets ADA. Their main
Hmm.
complaint is that many times this existing sidewalks and curb ramps are non-compliant, and the contractor does not want to direct pedestrians to a non-compliant route. So is it incumbent on the designers to design an ADA compliant route and sequence that in with the project or construction project?
That's a really good question. I think that the language in the FDM states that the temporary diversion must be as accessible or greater than the existing facility that's being closed or otherwise impacted by construction. So it must be as accessible. That would seemingly imply that if I have an existing non-compliant facility, that I could make the temporary diversion equally non-compliant, right? Well, I think the answer to that is no. That would be a misapplication of that provision, because new construction, and I would suppose or submit to you that the providing of a temporary pedestrian diversion is probably more likely going to fall under a new construction type category. New construction must be fully compliant. So if you have an existing facility that is not compliant and it's being closed or otherwise impacted by construction requiring the introduction of a diversion, the diversion must be fully compliant. Um, Again, to the greatest extent possible, and where it's not compliant, it would require a the processing of a variation.
All right, excellent. Okay, so another question from earlier, how is an ADA, and this may be a more of a design question, but I'll ask it. How is an ADA mat detectable warning surface to be attached to a temporary surface such as milling?
Hmm. That's a good question too. And in that case, I don't think the DOT necessarily has any specific guidance there. At the end of the day, again, the facility must be safe and accessible. So you don't want to end up with a condition where the detectable warning surface becomes loose or has an end that lifts up, because that could be not only a tripping hazard for your ambulatory crowd, but it could become a change in level greater than a quarter of an inch, which presents a barrier to accessibility for your individuals who have a disability. So at the end of the day, I think the engineer would be responsible for providing an appropriate attachment method that works with the walking surface that's being used. And if an effective method of attachment for the detectable warning surface can't be found for asphalt millings, then I would say you can't use asphalt millings.
Brad knows I'm very fond of using asphalt millings for temporary surfaces. But it bears repeating that everything is a matter of maintaining, and the more it's
Yeah.
used, the more it's going to get beat up. And if you've got trucks driving over it, it's going to get beat up. And then, those transitional surfaces won't be as good. As long as the contractor and the CEI are paying attention and routinely policing it, I think you're probably okay. That's my 2 cents.
Yeah, and Carrie, not to not to leave out any other districts, but I believe, Carrie, that you were with me on a QAR in District 5 where we saw asphalt millings being used very successfully in the temporary traffic control environment for pedestrians, where the millings were appropriately compacted and I guess constrained on the edges so that they weren't sloughing off. Um, it was they were it was very well done use of millings for a temporary walking surface.
Yeah, absolutely.
These have all been excellent questions. I hope so.
Yes,
They really are good, and they go to where our problems are, rather than to more obscure things that we don't see here in Florida. So thank you for your thoughtfulness. They're good questions.
sure, yeah, and this is a good opportunity to find out practical application of the criteria versus just a textbook, standard plan approach. So we thank you very much for your questions.
All right, excellent. Okay, so another question says, will the new 14-90 have any impact upon design standards such as the TNC drop-off areas?
I'm sorry, Kristen, could you repeat that one once more? I'm not sure what 14-90 is referring to.
Yeah, I'm not sure either. It says, will new 14-90 have any impact upon design standards such as TNC drop-off areas?
TNC, I'm not sure what that's.
All right, so maybe the person that asked that question, if you can provide us a little more information, and we can definitely get back to that one in a few minutes. All right, so the next question is, how does one line up a crossing with the dual ramps shown on 522-002 sheet 7?
Okay, I'm going to pull that up. 522,
Dash 002,
thank you, sheet 7.
sheet 7.
Okay, so what was the question? Which figure are they questioning?
Oh, I'm sorry. How does one line up a crossing with the dual ramps?
The dual ramps. I guess maybe they're talking about these curb ramps with radial return, maybe. Um, Aligning the crossing with the direction of the ramps. This is where there is an opportunity, certainly, for an innovative approach. I mentioned earlier a way to shorten the crossing distance is to scoot or push the crossing um, further back from the intersection. And in this case, I think an approach that should be looked at. It may impact other issues such as drainage and again the signalization distance and so forth, stop bar location. But if you can push these ramps into the tangent of the curb line, then you're going to have that perpendicular joint of the at the bottom of the ramp. It's going to be perpendicular with the interface to the roadway, and then the crossing is going to be the shortest possible, pushed that distance back from the crossing. Now, what's on the screen? Obviously, this is standard plan. So if this is what your design has, then it's technically compliant with DOT. But what we're asking is for the engineer of records to go beyond, I think what Carrie said, go beyond the minimums and see if there's a better solution that we can provide that would make the crossing and the ped facility in general that much more safe and accessible for all users. Um, Shortening the crossing distance, which is going to reduce the risk of exposure to vehicular traffic, I think is obviously better for all users, not just people with disabilities. Um, so anything we do to improve accessibility is going to help all users. Hopefully that answered that question.
All right. If not, anyone can always raise your hand and unmute and ask your question and better than I'm asking it, or ask additional details. So feel free to do that. Let me go back to a question from earlier, kind of changing the topics here. And this is, I'm not sure if you'll know anything about this, but are you aware of any apps that sync with the pedestrian head controllers to provide pedestrian signal information to them, like on their phone, approaching the intersection?
That's an interesting question, and yes, I am aware of that functionality. I can't remember um, the vendor product that has actually been used as a pilot project in District 6. But if this person wants to reach out to Tiffany Gerke, who is our state complete streets coordinator. She was previously District 6's ADA coordinator down in the Miami area. But if you want to reach out to Tiffany Gerke up here in central office, then she can probably, or she'll definitely be able to give you more information on a particular vendor that the DOT has used as a pilot to to demonstrate that functionality and that technology.
Yeah, that's awesome. There's so many things that are up and coming with technology. It's very
Yeah,
interesting.
yeah, it is. But the phone essentially connects to the accessible pedestrian signal, the APS, through Bluetooth, and it provides, you know, that provides the user of the smartphone the ability to adjust the volume to their liking and to their needs. It also provides wayfinding instructions verbally through the app to locate the ramp and to safely navigate the crossing. So it's really quite an impressive um, technology.
All right, awesome. And I'm putting a link in the chat right now to the FDOT website with the not only the district bike ped coordinator information, but also with Tiffany's information at the bottom as well, so everyone can
Cool.
have her contact information.
Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. And so this may also be a question for Tiffany, but I'll ask you, since we got it here in chat, what is the criteria to design with an audible push button?
Well, essentially the FDM, and maybe I'll go ahead and pull that information up since we're discussing it. But the FDM now requires that all signalized intersections that contain pedestrian facilities approaching the intersection must be made to be APS ready. So let me find that real quick here. Maybe it's in volume 1. I think it is now that I think about it here. Just go to the whole manual. But essentially, when we have a new construction or reconstruction roadway project that goes through, here it is. It says where pedestrian facilities are provided, include provisions, for example, conduit conductors, signal cables that are needed for future use of APS devices on all new and reconstructed signalized intersections and signalized mid-block crossing locations. And there's additional information here in the TEM chapter 3, section 7 for the installation and operation criteria of the APS. So for the one who's asking that question, if these two references, the FDM chapter 232 and the TEM chapter 3.7, if you don't find the answer to what you need in those two references, then please reach out to me by phone or email, and we'll find that information for you.
All right, thanks, Brad. And kind of related to that, is there any coordination with the Florida Division of Blind Services for identifying neighborhoods that have people with visual impairments, so they know where to incorporate these types of things into the projects in that area?
Again, that's a good question. And currently, the DOT's policy, as demonstrated here or documented in the TEM chapter 3.7, the current policy is that we will provide APS upon request and the conducting of a engineering study to determine the best location and use of the APS. That's current policy, but we are actively working towards a more proactive approach to the installation of APS. And the reason why we can't just automatically say, well, let's just install APS everywhere that we have a signalized intersection is because the blind services groups like the Lighthouse for the Blind and so forth have demonstrated to us in the past that having every signalized intersection equipped with APS is not necessarily the best or safest approach because we don't want to inadvertently lead an individual with a visual disability down an undesirable path, which you would essentially be doing if you made every signalized intersection APS ready, or excuse me, APS uh, installed. So what we're in the process of doing is shifting from the process of installing APS when we receive a request to a more proactive look, and we're actually incorporating the use of GIS technology so that we can overlay um, data points such as signalized intersections within certain context classifications with certain um, pedestrian demography or demographics, certain pedestrian makeup near certain um, uh, services like hospitals, schools, malls, grocery stores. We're trying to take the totality of all that information, overlay it within a GIS format so we can identify um, a better way of prioritizing the location for the installation of APS. Um, so to answer your question a little bit more succinctly is that we're not there yet, but we're definitely moving in that direction.
And Brad, if you'll let me add that if we have anyone on the line that does work for a local agency or city or county, or works for a city or county, please, I don't care. I mean, there's nothing wrong with having people request and then following up on that request. Nothing at all. But it shouldn't be the only factor. You should be looking at all the factors. Some of them being your, the volume of ped traffic, and then also the vulnerability, as you pointed out, of the neighborhood, any partners that might be in the area. And I think it's very important, especially within cities and counties, that you call your Center for Independent Living or make contact with the Lighthouse of the Blind and ask, what areas are giving us the most trouble. They understand the resources won't support universal APS, even if they wanted that, which as Brad pointed out, they don't. But they're willing to work with you in prioritizing that, and that is going to limit your suability. So if you're working with these partners, these are the same partners that have the deeper pockets to sue you for violations of the ADA. If you can demonstrate working with them, it certainly strengthens your position. So
Sure.
not saying there's anything wrong with asking the public to request APS, just don't make that the only factor in your decision making.
Right. And to expand upon that a little bit more, Carrie, District 6 has an extremely capable ADA team that evaluates the requests for APS, and they have communicated with me that on more than one occasion they have identified a better routing, if you will, for the location of where APS can be installed for a particular APS requester than what the requester initially asked for. In other words, the route that was asked for um, traversed intersections that were deemed to not be the safest use of APS because of their size or complexity or the number of conflict points that would have to be mitigated because the intersection was so large. Whereas they were able to adjust the routing that didn't add any more length to the particular destination points that were desired, but the crossings were located at smaller sized intersections with less volume and fewer number of turning movements and so forth. So overall, it made the installation and routing for APS to be a much safer and accessible experience for not just the individual who was requesting, but really for all users.
All right, great. And I have a question that someone says is kind of related to the FDM and APS. can a municipality remove signals altogether in an area and replace them with stop signs?
Removing signals altogether, that's going to be a traffic operations question. It definitely goes beyond the scope of just pure ADA accessibility. But I would
Maybe we could
imagine,
broaden the question a little bit to say, can you remove an accessibility feature um, and not violate the ADA? And I think if it's a broader question than that, I would say yes. We've had circumstances where where local agencies have curb ramps in areas where it's simply not safe for them to be there. And when faced with the choice of what are we going to do about it, they've elected to remove those accessibility features so that they don't have people in the roadway there. And that's okay. You'll get criticized, there's no doubt, and complaints do come in. But we have not, so far, we have not yet found validity for any complaint where this driving factor is safety and there's alternative accessibility in the area.
so Carrie, you've said it this way before, that we never sacrifice safety in the name of compliance with the ADA. Is that fair?
I think that's fair to say, and I certainly don't. We don't give people the right to hurt themselves by providing a curb ramp if there shouldn't be one there. If the crash statistics or the volume of traffic, or if there's another area that's safer, we're certainly not going to push back for an agency that makes a tough decision to remove something that's otherwise accessible. We're not your enemies here. We're trying to work with you, and we are going to hold safety to a high standard, as we should.
Right. And where those cases exist where a curb ramp at a particular location is not desirable or the best as far as safety is concerned, then we want the agencies to do their due diligence and try to determine, especially if there are requests from the public for the installation of some curb ramps, then the agencies should be doing their due diligence to locate um, a routing network, if you will, that would be considered a safe alternative to that condition.
All right, perfect. So another question kind of related, since we're talking about detection systems, what about passive pedestrian detection system? How does that kind of align with ADA? Or not even sure if that is an appropriate way to ask that question, but if that
Uh,
makes sense.
yeah, that's fine, Kristen. Thanks for the question. Um, there have been those in the central office who have argued for using passive detection everywhere. And to my knowledge, that has not necessarily gained a lot of traction, um, probably because it may not be the most appropriate approach, universally speaking. But there are some locations probably where passive detection does make sense. In fact, there's a mid-block crossing right in front of the Burns building here in Tallahassee that has passive detection activation of the RRFB, the rectangular rapid flashing beacon. And I think that's a very appropriate use of passive detection. Um, so that, unfortunately, the answer is either I don't know or it depends. We do have people looking at it, and we're trying to determine what the best decision is to land on for a policy. But for right now, the whatever's in the TEM today is the governing law of the land as far as detection of pedestrians. And typically you'll find that to be push buttons.
All right, great. So let's go back to a topic we talked about earlier. We have another question about contractor responsibility. So this person says that they find that the contractors divert and detour pedestrians onto existing sidewalks that have no maintenance. So what responsibility does the contractor have to maintain the accessibility of those walks while the others are being brought up to ADA standards?
Well, I think we kind of addressed this or touched on this earlier, but it is my opinion that if you're closing an existing, and actually I take that back, it's not my opinion, it's actually written into the DOT criteria, that if you're closing an existing facility, then the temporary facility that's being provided must meet the same level of accessibility or better. And I've already addressed the fact that if you have an existing non-compliant facility, that you cannot put an equally non-compliant facility in as a temporary solution. So I think this is where the engineer needs to do their due diligence during the design process and provide in the contract plans from the beginning a workable temporary pedestrian diversion scenario that the contractor can install. Because at the end of the day, it's not the contractor's responsibility to design the temporary traffic control for pedestrians. It is the responsibility under contract for the EOR to provide those details. That means that in probably 99% of the times, a note that references providing accessibility according to Standard Plans Index 102-660 is not going to suffice. There are only a very limited few, and I've had discussions with the state standard plans engineer here in Tallahassee, and he's actually the one who verbalized it this way, that there's a very limited number of projects or type of projects that could conceivably suffice with just a note referencing compliance with the standard plans 102-660. And that would be for your very simple sidewalk slab replacements. We're very limited impact to existing facilities. But I think for the great majority, 99% plus of the projects that are affecting existing facilities, the EOR needs to provide a scheme or scenario that the contractor can not only build that's completely compliant, but that they can do quantity takeoffs to do an accurate bid for. So the EOR needs to provide a diversion scenario in the plans that the contractor can build. In other words, all the placement details are there, and result in a safe and accessible pedestrian diversion.
Okay.
And that's not just a DOT requirement, but there's actually Florida state law. It's in the statutes, and it's also in the federal regulations. So from the DOT level, Chapter 240 of the FDM, Section 2, so 240.2 states that a temporary traffic control plan is required for all work zones within or adjacent to highways, roads, and streets on as specified by Florida statute and federal regulations. Typical applications of some commonly encountered situations are shown in the MUTCD. Some of these typical applications have been modified by the standard plans 102 series. Most work zones, and I would qualify that and say the great majority of work zones, will require further development of the typical applications to address project specific conditions. So again, if you have a very simple sidewalk slab replacement, then maybe a note referencing 102-660 might suffice. But I would suggest to you that only would it be appropriate if the contractor would be able to provide a completely safe and accessible, compliant diversion. To expand on that just a little further, the reference to the Florida statutes is 337.11, paragraph 14. I'll repeat that. It's Florida statutes 337.11, paragraph 14. And it says that each contract let by the department for performance of road or bridge construction or maintenance work must contain traffic maintenance plan, which shows the appropriate regulatory speeds and signs and so forth. So that includes pedestrian maintenance of traffic, or what we call TTC now.
All right, very good. And it looks like we actually might have a taker for someone that wants to unmute and ask a question here. So let me just unmute. And so Jacqueline or Jacqueline, I apologize if I'm saying that incorrectly. If you're there.
You're fine. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Yes.
Okay. I just and I'm new on this, so I apologize for my ignorance on a lot of this stuff. But when you were talking about the pedestrian detection device, not the detection device, but the let me see, you still have it up there, the PSFs, the SPFs. So, and then in conjunction with the truncated domes, so I was trying to understand, looking back at that example where you're talking about the DOT office that had that diagonal crosswalk that looked like it was painted over pavers, like for the impervious or pervious surface that was at a diagonal, but then the ramp was not facing, not aligned with the crosswalk. So in my mind, I was thinking, well, how is the blind person to know that they have to go diagonally? And I understand now that the truncated domes, it was another one, the DOT office. You said it was somewhere in, up north. I think it was a DOT office. Oh, Tallahassee, I think you said.
Oh yeah, the Cascades
Um,
Park.
so that's, yeah, at a park. So if in conjunction with what you were talking about right now, that not all of these PSFs are to be placed everywhere, how
Jacqueline,
does
what is a PSF?
the pedestrian signal feature, like for the blind person?
Oh, APS,
I'm sorry, I keep leaving
accessible
that A
pedestrian
out.
signal.
Yes. Um,
It's
so
slide 41, I think, Brad.
41.
Yes, I think so.
Oh, thank you.
there it is. Yeah.
Okay, thank
So
you both.
you see, you have that diagonally going, and so the truncated dome is just to alert the blind person, you need to stop, you're about to go enter a dangerous intersection. Um, but without, how does the blind person is going to know there that they got to go diagonally?
That's a very good question. And if you were able to see this location in person, you'll see that this is diagonal parking against the curb. And there is a two-lane roadway right behind where the picture taker is standing. So strictly speaking, and Carrie, you help me out, please, with this, but strictly speaking, detectable warning surfaces are not necessarily appropriate within a parking lot. But again, this is not a true parking lot. This is diagonal parking against the curb, and there's a two-lane roadway right behind here.
Yeah,
Um,
Jacqueline's got the right question, but it's not a good example for the picture because this is parking. For me to answer her question, they don't know. They're entirely reliant on the pavement surface and the thermoplastic. If it's not aligned, they're going to have to, if it's underfoot, they're going to be using the pavement markings to determine what way they're going. APS helps, especially if they're directional cues, because they can feel that directional cue and follow that direction. But it's a good point you're bringing up, and it's one that we have problems with. They don't intuitively know. And
yes,
it really isn't people who are blind that are our main concern, believe it or not. They typically go something through wayfinding training. So their normal paths of travel, they go through training with a professional, so they know where they're going and what the conditions are going to be, and so they know. But think about all the baby boomers that are now moving into older area people, like my parents who are approaching their late 70s. They've been perfectly mobile and they've had perfectly fine vision and hearing, but now they're slowing down a little bit and they can't see things as well, and they're very much dependent on what we put out there. So you're bringing up an important point, and I think it highlights what Brad said earlier, that changing these designs just a little bit, or thinking safety as well as accessibility when you're designing, can make a lot of difference, because um, these pedestrian facilities, these accessibility facilities, they're not going to solve every problem, and certainly the one you bring up won't be solvable.
Thank you.
right. And to add on, Jacqueline, to what Carrie was just saying, why would we as designers want to provide the minimum that's required when for a minor tweak and a little shift to what we're doing can enhance the safety and accessibility tremendously. So that's why I would say please don't rely completely on the standard plan's details, because that's the minimum acceptable design criteria for the state highway system. But
Yes, and
don't
the same at
provide,
the federal level too.
yeah,
Our ADA regulations at the federal level, they don't talk about things like lighting or drop-offs because they're not considered part of accessibility, but they're really, really critical to safety. And I think recognizing that and FDOT recognizing that pushes us to do more, maybe go beyond the minimums. But it was a great question, Jacqueline, and I don't think you
yes.
should feel insecure about being new to it. These are exactly the kind of questions that we tackle all the time.
Right. And Carrie, you see here with the pavement markings are on these perforated pavers or whatever, that would make them, in my thinking, that much less detectable or less usable as a detectable feature for someone who is impaired
Oh,
visually.
absolutely. I would argue, and this is a similar case I've got in Orlando, near a park in downtown Orlando, where the detectable warning, the truncated domes aren't that much different in feel from the pavered surface that they're using for the crossing. You don't really know where you are. And nobody's fault. It's the way that it was designed in construction and constructed, and at the time it was perfectly compliant. But now we're going to ask the city, go back and rethink this, because what message really are you sending to your pedestrians? And they're going to have to go beyond just ADA. They're going to have to think about safety and the condition of their roadway facility.
Right. And minor tweaks that drastically improve the safety and accessibility of these features probably are going to have a negligible impact on the scope and budget of the project. So I would urge the design community, especially, to just apply that foresight thinking when you're putting these elements in place, and do those little tweaks and shifts and improvements, enhancements that really make a big difference.
All right, very good. Well, we've got another taker that wants to unmute. So, John, I am giving you audio privileges. You should be able to unmute by just clicking on the microphone in your control panel.
Okay, thank
We
you,
hear
Brad
you.
and Carrie, for being here and sharing your experience. My question is to slide 73, I think it is. When you gave the presentation, you made a comment about, no, maybe it's 63, the slope of the cross path. Hold on, I have your presentation open on mine. It's
John, what is the
73.
topic of the slide?
This was maintenance, but
Okay.
73? Huh,
That's 73.
okay, your slides don't match mine.
What is the
cross slope. So there's a provision that speaks to the crosswalk that crosses the intersection and the cross slope to the grade of the street, the
what
roadway.
is there an FDM reference on the slide that you're looking at?
No, because you made a comment to it. You had your colleague standing there with a level, but you were.
Oh, okay.
Oh, it's page 145. Maybe that's correct. Yes, the gentleman in the right one, next one, 146.
Okay, good. I'm glad we could get to the same page, as they say.
So the picture on the right, you had made a comment about the slope, the grade of the pavement, and earlier in the presentation, I believe you referenced a provision that when the roadway is that makes an exception to the cross slope for the pedestrian path.
Yeah, actually, let me see if I can find that language in the FDM. Let me bear with me a real quick second here. Hopefully I can find it real quick with this Control F. Okay, here it is. This is the page I think I was thinking of as you were speaking. But the crossings are required to meet the same grade and cross slope requirements as the sidewalk. Where that's not possible, then the DOT, as a Title II public entity, as described by the ADA, is required to do or provide the most accessible criteria that we can, or condition that we can. But if it's not meeting the DOT criteria, then it is going to require a design variation that's approved by the district design engineer. Did I answer what you're getting at?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, you're welcome. So yes, just for everybody's benefits, the cross slope and grades of the roadway crossings are required by the DOT and the ADA for ADA compliance to meet this, to be the same criteria as the sidewalks themselves.
Except for running slopes, right, Brad?
Well, right. If the running slopes, the running slope of the crossing is going to be the cross slope of the roadway that it's crossing, right? So there are some allowances there depending on whether or not you're at a signalized intersection. And Kiri, you would ask that because now I'm going to have to Control F, look for something else here.
Well, what I went to highlight is that the running slope, the running slope used to be that of the ramp regardless, and the maximum was 8.3, but now we look at it as you can follow the existing grade of the adjacent roadway, but it has to be the adjacent roadway. It can't be like a completely separate multi-use facility, but that does make it a lot easier in places like Ocala and Mount Dora and Tallahassee, where we simply can't keep a 5% to 8.3% running slope.
Right. So that, yeah, and Kiri, you're talking about sidewalks that are parallel to a roadway can follow the same profile grade of that roadway.
That's right.
But for crossings, there are a little bit more, I guess, more stringent requirements. And I wanted to highlight this from, there's not an FDM reference, from chapter 222, section 2.3, where it says that the maximum cross slope for crosswalks is 2%. The only exception to that that's actually written in here, so you don't, if you can't meet the 2%, but you have this condition, it's not going to require a design variation. Crosswalks that are located at a signalized intersection or mid-block or driveway, the cross slope may exceed 2%, but not be greater than 5%. So you can exceed 2 up to 5 when you have a signalized intersection, mid-block, or driveway. And again, that's in the FDM chapter 222, 2.3.
All right, excellent. All right, so let's take another question from the chat until we have any other takers that want to unmute. So one of the challenges in when you're milling and resurfacing is that usually that happens at night, and typically all the pedestrian traffic is blocked and there is no detour route close by. So if there is closure to all pedestrians, and how does that address or not address the ADA requirements?
I think that's something that ultimately you would want to work out with the district, because they're going to be the ultimate authority when it comes to project specific questions. But generally speaking, if you have an existing pedestrian facility that's being impacted by construction, I don't know, Kiri, what do you think? Maybe if you have conducted maybe an abbreviated study of the location, and you can find and you can show demonstrably that during the hours of the closure on a typical weekday and weekend nights, there is zero pedestrian traffic, then maybe you can get away without providing the temporary pedestrian diversion. I'm just not sure about that.
Well, no, you've got it right. I think the standard rule is that you're going to provide the same level of accessibility that was there before, but maybe things change in a nighttime environment where you're paving from, let's say, 11 p.m. to 4 a.m. And, one, you don't find it particularly safe to have them there at that time of day and night, and you can document or make the argument that that there are other accessible routes in the area, for example. That's one of those areas that we're not likely to question your judgment if you can document why you made the decision.
Definitely. Thank you, Kiri.
All right. Another question that came in a little bit earlier. So, is DOT working at all with the post office in terms of placing mailboxes in safe locations? Because a lot of times those are placed in kind of locations that are convenient for the delivery drivers, and can sometimes cause issues for persons with disabilities.
I've never encountered that question, so I can't tell you for sure if the United States Postal Service has ever been um, pinged on this type of question. Unfortunately, I don't know.
I don't either, but I think we should write it down because it kind of goes to the same thing about transit stops. We'll get a provider just plop something down in an unapproved area, and then expect eventually that the sidewalks will grow to it. To what extent should you be working with these providers? Newspaper, not as much now as maybe in the early 2000s, but newspapers, just receptacles just being plopped down any old where, or benches on the pedestrian rights of way. So I think it's the same type of issue, but we've just never thought about it in terms of mailboxes.
Sure, and the engineer of record, if your project is furnishing and installing mailboxes, the EOR definitely has responsibility under the ADA to provide, or to not inhibit, I should say, at the accessible pedestrian route. So there's opportunity there in the absence of specific direction from the DOT to exercise good engineering judgment and place the mailbox where it won't conflict with the pedestrian route.
But it's such an interesting question, Brad. And the minute the minute that Kristen read it out, I can immediately think of 3 examples of mailboxes that are placed in places where the speed is too quick for the turn, where you could have some issues with pedestrians, or where it's actually too close, where it's narrowing the path of travel. Perhaps not illegally narrowing the path of travel, but certainly something we wouldn't want to see. So it's worth looking into, and it's
Sure.
thank you for the question.
Yeah, that was a good question. Yeah, at the end of the day, the ADA is meant to remove barriers to accessibility. So if we have something that's even inadvertently placed that's causing a barrier to accessibility, then we certainly want to address that to the greatest extent possible. So thank you for that question.
Yeah, I love that about these sessions. Sometimes we're also getting ideas from the questions that are asked, so that's great.
Yeah.
Kristen, I've loved every minute of this. The questions are the right questions, and I'm so pleased that we're not having to deal with snow removal and other questions that sometimes come up in broader trainings. This office hour, this is just a genius idea. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, and if there's a demand for it, I'm certainly not opposed to scheduling another one, down the road. So just keep that in mind, folks. If you are liking this and would like to see it done on this topic again, just let us know.
Yeah, absolutely. When everyone, yeah, I'm already seeing notes in the chat saying yes, please schedule them regularly.
Well,
So let us know in that survey that you do when you exit everyone. If you want to see more of these in the future, let us know, and we'll definitely do this again. So yeah, we haven't even gotten to our prepared questions, and we've just been taking a lot of questions from everyone. So these are great. Yeah, we've got 2 more here. So the first one, let's go back to that slide 38. That seems to be causing us a lot of questions. All right, perfect. So this one says, in the case of slide 38 and the current ramp alignment, do you prefer to see a one-piece detectable warning with the domes askew to the crosswalk, or the detectable warning material cut into a few pieces in order to align the domes with the crosswalk?
I think having a whole detectable warning surface that is a whole installation, I think is probably going to be better for the longevity of the installation, meaning that there are fewer edges that can delaminate from the walking surface, and therefore you'll have less opportunity for changes in level and tripping hazards and that sort of thing. I think ultimately, though, like I've drawn in here with the red lines and the shaded area indicating a detectable warning surface, if you can adjust or tweak the geometry of the interface with the pedestrian facility with the roadway, then you can maximize the the orientation of the detectable warning surface. So maybe you won't need to piece something together to make it compliant. But again, I think the best installation is a detectable warning surface mat that's whole. But if you do have to cut it to make it compliant, then there's nothing saying that you can't do that. You just need to make sure that the way it's done is going to remain firm, stable, slip resistant for its service life.
I'd agree with that, and I'd only add to it that, you know, I inspect, if you work in the LAP program or for agencies that do a lot of LAP projects, I do a lot of your inspections for before final acceptance, and I pay no attention to dome alignment, none, ever.
Okay.
I do find that one piece detectable warnings that are cemented in there and adhered in at least two different ways, bolted and adhered or put into the concrete, they're going to last longer, and your maintenance folks aren't going to fuss as much as when you try to piece them up. Particularly if I vary with heavy rains and sand and detritus build up, it's going to pop up those pieced up pieces a lot quicker than the overall surface.
And Carrie, that brings up a good point too that we've encountered lots of questions about is the detectable warning surface installations that are being overrun by turning vehicles. Well, that presents a whole safety issue in and of itself. Ideally, in that condition, I think you would want to try to configure the crossing and the intersection, the turnout radius in such a way as that you're going to deter vehicle overruns in that case. But yeah, in that case also, it might be an opportunity to use a more durable detectable warning surface product. Like we've seen some
And
that
thicker
are,
concrete too, usually.
yeah, exactly. Maybe introducing a raised curbed pork chop, if you will, that's going to deter turning vehicles from hitting it. Anyway, there's a lot of opportunity in those situations for innovative solutions. And remember, just because it doesn't look exactly like the standard plan does not mean that it's going to be non-compliant. It actually means that the engineer is doing their due diligence and they're providing a design that goes beyond the minimums that are presented in the standard plans. So in my book, that gets kudos. And if you encounter a reviewer who is pushing back because the ramp doesn't look like the standard plans, then if need be, I don't want to ever get in between the district and their consultants, but I'd be willing to ask to help answer a question if one ever were to arise.
All
And
right,
I
great.
don't mind. I don't mind getting in the way. So please feel free to ask me. We're really trying to do a better job here. We're really trying to cement safety and accessibility together. It's going to take all of us, and if that means having a healthy debate on a specific project issue, please include us. We're happy to help.
Yeah, I don't have any control over funding, but Carrie might have a little bit more control over the federal aid side.
All right, great. Okay, so I've got Jacqueline again, has raised her hand, so you want to unmute and ask your question? You should be able to.
Yes, and it goes back to when you guys were talking about the railroad. I had issues getting on earlier this morning, but you guys were talking about the railroad crossings, and this might be more of a question to Mr. Carey because there are sidewalks out there that basically just end, right? Because we can't get across. So how would you advise to have a more expedite process to be able to get the railroads to work with us to be able to get some of these sidewalk crossings through the railroad tracks? And speaking of funding, like how would you advise me or any of us to try to get that done so that some of these sidewalks can be used across the railroad tracks?
Yes, it's this is why Brad and I still have jobs. I don't think it's a problem we're ever going to solve. But it is well. But the first thing we're going to ask you to do is not to design and construct a non-compliant facility simply because you can't get the railroads to call you back. Make documented efforts to work with your railroad partner to provide a usable, firm, stable, slip-resistant surface. And when you find that isn't occurring, I hope that you will call Brad or me and let us help. The FDOT Rail Safety Office maintains very good relationships with the railroads, and if we need to do a Hail Mary, we've got contacts at the Federal Railroad Administration, and we will go to them and say, hey, the railroad's getting in the way of safety and accessibility. But just recognize that we're at cross purposes. It is not in the benefit, it doesn't benefit the agency, the railroad agencies, to have people cross their right of way. They're not in the business of people accessing their right of way. They're in the freight and sometimes passenger business. And we recognize the fact that Florida has grown up from a very rural place to a place where we've got pedestrians all over the place in urban environments where there are train tracks. We're just working at cross purposes. And I know it isn't always easy to get a hold of them, but I will tell you, Jacqueline, we've come a long way in 10 years. There was a time when the best way to talk to CSX was to stand on the tracks and get arrested by their own police force. It's it's better. But if you find that you're all are being pushed to compromise safety and accessibility because of lack of response from your railroad partner, let us know.
Sure. And Carrie, just to add to that, if I'm not mistaken, there's a railroad coordinator or liaison in every district office. So even if the project you're working on isn't necessarily on a state highway system, but it's on a local roadway, I would think that you could still reach out to the district's rail coordinator and see what kind of resources or assistance they can provide.
Absolutely. I don't even think my question would be whether it's a state road or not. It would be, hey, we've got a problem here, and
Yeah.
And if you can't solve it locally, let us try and help. We've had some real successes, but it's taken cooperation. So don't lose our number, Jacqueline, and continue to document the efforts you make to provide safe and accessible facilities.
Yeah, and just for those who might be interested in getting my contact information, it's up on the screen now. Kristen, it looks like we're down to less than 5 minutes. Is there anything else that stands out at you?
Yeah, well, I tell you what, we just have one question left, so it looks like it's going to be perfect timing.
Wow.
Carrie, there's also a question for you in there directly for you. I'm not sure if you saw that, so just want to bring your attention to that. So this last question says, is there any standards or details to address pedestrian crossing at limited access terminals where there isn't any stop control devices or has a terminal free flowing?
I wonder if we could get an example. While we're waiting for an example, let me say that when we talk about federal standards and the PROAG and the ADAG, we are not really talking about Florida. Florida has adopted its FDOT design manual as its ADA standards for state facilities, and the Green Book is the authority, the design standards for for locally owned roads. The only time we refer to PROAG or the DOJ resources is when there's something in the FDEM or the Green Book that doesn't address the issue. Then we will look to the federal standards. So what we're saying is, even though you can't go below the federal standards, Florida is actually holding all of our agencies, regardless of whether it's state-owned or locally, to a much higher standard. And that's the place we should look first. And before turning to, what does the federal government say? Remember, the federal government did not look at every possible accessibility issue. We don't look at drop-offs, which I think is a great example. But so I always look to Brad's sources first before turning to the federal one to say, hey, we need some guidance here. Having said that, maybe an example would help me answer the question or help Brad.
Yeah.
Yes, I'm not sure if we'll have time for that today, but you see Brad's contact information is on the screen here. You're welcome to reach out to him directly, or you can reach out to the LTAP Center. So I think let's close this out. So before I hand things over to Brad and Carrie to close this out, I just want to thank everyone for being here. This has been excellent. You've asked so many great questions and been an active participant. We couldn't have done it without you. So this has been really enjoyable. So I hope you've had a lot of fun. So Brad and Carrie, I'll let you close this out.
Well,
Okay.
Kristen, to close out on my side, let me answer what the dude may have been asking. So we get a lot of questions about what happens when the sidewalk ends and do we put a curb ramp there if there's no facility on the other side? And if that is the direction you're going in, the best thing I can tell you is don't leave people in vehicular harm way. So if you decide to put in the curb ramp on the other side, make sure there is at least a way to get out of the roadway. Otherwise, don't make that curb cut because you're telling folks it's safe for you to be in the road here. Remember, it doesn't have to be a marked crossing to be a crossing. The fact that curb cut is there with the detectable warning is going to be telling your public a whole lot, regardless of what's on the other side. So be logical. If you anticipate a sidewalk being put in on the other side at some point, maybe it's a good idea to go ahead and make those curb cuts, the paired curb cuts. And in anticipation. If it's residential, it doesn't look like there is ever going to be anything. Maybe you decide not to put in a curb cut at the sidewalk terminus. And I don't know if that's what you were asking, but I saw it in some of the questions on our spreadsheet. So just in case. And thank you. These were great questions, and I'm happy to participate in a semi-regular event like this. I think it's we've all gotten a lot out of it.
Yeah, Carrie, I agree, and I'm very grateful for everybody who attended and those who sent in their questions or were brave enough to vocalize them. Thank you, Jacqueline, and the other questioner. And if I had anything that I wanted to leave you with as we close out the session, is the two most important, I guess, the two biggest challenges that Carrie and I have seen in the state of Florida when it comes to ADA accessibility are going to be the ped button orientation. Remember that button face must be parallel to the direction of crossing that it serves. So it needs to be covered in design, it needs to be covered in construction, and of course that could be covered by our construction engineering inspectors. Number two is that there must be an EOR provided temporary pedestrian accommodation whenever there's going to be an existing facility that's impacted by construction. So if the EOR is going to be impacting an existing facility, they must provide in the plans sufficient details so that the contractor can build it, so it can be safe and accessible, and so that the contractor can do a quantity takeoff on the temporary traffic control devices. So those are the two biggest points I want to leave you with. Thank you again for joining us, and if there's enough interest, we'll definitely do it again.
All right, sounds good. I saw a couple of folks are raising their hand at the end. I'm sorry we didn't get a chance to get to you in the last 2 minutes, but definitely join us when we do this again in the future. Raise your hand earlier. We'll definitely give you an opportunity to speak with Brad and Carrie. So everyone, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great upcoming weekend, and we'll talk to you soon. Take care.